Open your lesson in the Civil War called Lee and Grant. Our objectives for this lesson are to describe the events in life of Robert E. Lee, trace the events in life of Ulysses S. Grant. Lee and Grant. Lee and Grant. Anyone who has ever heard about the American Civil War has heard these two names mentioned. Too often when studying the achievements of great men and women, we forget that they are not superheroes, but human beings like ourselves. They have their great moments and their flaws just like everyone else. Greatness does not come from how much power or money you have. Greatness comes from how you treat other human beings. Are you fair and honest? Can you be counted on when the chips are down? Or are you nowhere to be found? In this lesson, you'll learn about two of America's most famous generals, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Knowing how they conducted their personal lives will tell you a lot about their characters and why they are considered two American heroes. They were those rare individuals who were admired even by their enemies. They are worth getting to know a little better. Look at your vocabulary words. The overseer of an estate after the owner dies is an executor. Words or deeds that sound too crazy to be true is a paradox. Nationally, a brief economic downturn is a recession. To turn back or defeat is a repulse. Wilmer McLean had an interesting bit of history to tell. His property had once been the scene of the Civil War's first battle, Bull Run. He was close enough to the action that a cannonball crashed through his roof and landed in the dining room. It was not much fun to have cannonballs disrupting dinner, so realizing that the area between Richmond and Washington was probably going to be the scene of other battles, he moved 120 miles to the south. He moved his family to a home near Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Okay, so go ahead and put your date in your notes. Okay, right now we're going to talk about Wilmer McLean. It said that his property was the scene of the Civil War's first battle. And that was Bull Run. So he moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Once again, his home became the scene of the battle, but this time it was the last. Now 2 men sat across from one another at his home. One was dressed in perfectly clean military uniform, while the other wore a tattered, dirty one. The mood was solemn as they spoke for a moment about old times during the previous war. After a few brief words, the 2 men shook hands and saluted one another. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant had agreed to an end to the present conflict. Okay, Okay, so he moved, and now his property was the scene of the last battle of the war. Property was the scene of the last battle of the war. Okay, so Wilmer McLean, his property was the scene of the Civil War's first battle, Bull Run, so he moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, because he thought where he lived would be too dangerous. And then his property was the scene of the last battle of the war. I guess he really does have a unique story to tell, doesn't he? And then, not only that, but Grant and Lee sat in his home when they agreed to end the war. Okay, we're going to talk about Robert E. Lee. These two Civil War heroes had very different backgrounds growing up. Okay, so let's discuss them. Grant and Lee sat in his home and agreed to end the war. Are you finished with that? Let's try to give you a moment. Let me read a little bit of this first. These two Civil War heroes had very different backgrounds growing up. Robert E. Lee was born at the Stratford Hall Plantation in Virginia. He grew up there until his father died when he was 12. The family soon moved in with a series of relatives. Lee grew up in a devoutly Christian home. He entered the military academy at West Point at the age of 18, graduating second in his class. He was known as an excellent student who did well in math and was the first student to graduate as a sergeant. Okay, so let's talk about Robert E. Lee. He was born Stratford Hall Plantation, born at Stratford Hall Plantation, in Virginia. His father died when he was 12. Father died when Robert was 12. He grew up in a Christian home. Okay. Okay, he grew up in a Christian home. He entered military academy at West Point. Okay, so at 18, he entered military. That's supposed to be a capital M, by the way. Military Academy at West Point. He graduated second in his class. He was the first to graduate as a sergeant. First to graduate as a sergeant. Okay, we said Robert E. Lee was born at Stratford Hall Plantation in Virginia. His father died when Robert was 12. He grew up in a Christian home. At 18 years old, he entered military academy at West Point. He graduated second in his class, and he was the first to graduate as a sergeant. He went into engineering a few years after West Point and remained in that profession until the Mexican-American War. Okay, so he was an engineer. He served under Winfield Scott and was wounded once in the battle. So he served in the Mexican-American War. It said he was wounded in battle. He became a captain 7 years later, serving in the U.S. Cavalry. Okay, he was wounded in battle. Okay, became a captain 7 years later. Seven years later, he became a captain. Okay, and that's when he served in the U.S. Cavalry. So in U.S. Cavalry. Okay. So when Lee was 18 years old, he entered the military academy at West Point. He graduated second in his class. He was the first to graduate as a sergeant. He went into engineering. He served in the Mexican-American War. He was wounded in the battle. 7 years later, he became a captain in the U.S. Cavalry. When Lee's father-in-law passed away in 1857, he became the executor of an estate with almost 200 slaves. He and his wife Mary, who was a great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, lived at the estate until it was seized by the Union during the Civil War. After the war, this estate became part of the Arlington National Cemetery. Okay. So, in 1857, I'm going to move over a little bit because I'm wasting a lot of room here. 1857, he became the executor of father-in-law's estate. And it said there were almost 200 slaves. Okay. It says he married the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. His wife was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. It says the Union seized the state during the Civil War. The Union seized the estate during the Civil War. And it became part of the Arlington National Cemetery. Okay, we said that in 1857, Lee became the executor of his father-in-law's estate, which had almost 200 slaves. His wife was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. The Union seized the estate during the Civil War, and it became part of the Arlington National Cemetery. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown led an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Lee was placed in charge of taking the arsenal back and arresting Brown. Leading a group of militia and Marines, Lee attacked Brown and his men, capturing them. Okay. Just a minute here. Somehow I got off a little bit. So in 1859, he captured John Brown after his attack on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The Civil War was filled with paradoxes that sometimes defy explanation. Robert E. Lee is a case in point. In the study of the Civil War, it has been noted that the South believed very strongly in the right of states to make their own decisions without interference from the federal government. This is the primary reason why they felt it acceptable to secede from the Union. Lee believed strongly that secession was wrong, bordering on an act of revolution. Yet when his home state of Virginia seceded from the Union early in 1861, he resigned his commission in the United States Army and became a Confederate commander a few days later. This just shows that in the South, before the Civil War, loyalty to America was secondary to loyalty towards your state. Okay. Lee thought secession was wrong. Lee thought secession was wrong, but he was loyal to his state. Lee was loyal to Virginia, that was his state. And when Virginia seceded, he became a Confederate commander. When Virginia seceded from the Union, seceded, did I spell that right? Lee supported his state. Lee, I don't want to say that, he resigned from the United States Army and became a Confederate commander. Okay, in 1859, Lee captured John Brown after his attack on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Lee didn't believe in secession. He thought secession was wrong, but he was loyal to Virginia. Virginia was his state. When Virginia seceded, Lee resigned from the U.S. Army and became a Confederate commander. Robert E. Lee was involved in many of the major battles of the Civil War. His daring plans and strategic moves caught the Union constantly off guard. Despite leading a much smaller army that was far less supplied than their military counterparts, Lee won battle after battle. Even today, he is considered one of the finest military leaders this nation has ever produced. Okay, we've already talked about before During the Civil War, Lee won many battles. He is considered to be one of the finest U.S. military leaders. After the war ended, Lee accepted the position of president at Washington College in Virginia. He worked there until his death in 1870. A man of honor and Christian dignity, Lee insisted that all students respect people of different races and backgrounds, even to the point of expelling students who showed otherwise. So after the war, he was president of Washington College. President of Washington College in Virginia. He required students to respect those of all races. It says he expelled those that didn't. Before his death, Lee applied for amnesty as a former Confederate commander. Through an error, his application was placed in a file without being acknowledged. His right to U.S. citizenship was not granted until 1975, after a government employee accidentally found the old application and notified President Ford. Lee passed away from the effects of a stroke on October 1870. He was one of the great American heroes. So he filed for amnesty. During the Civil War, Lee won many battles, and we've talked about him in our previous lessons. Lee was considered to be one of the finest U.S. military leaders. After the war, he became president of Washington College in Virginia. He required the students to respect those of all races. It says he filed for amnesty. His file was lost. It wasn't found until 1975, and he was granted U.S. citizenship. Okay, and it says that in October of 1870, he died of a stroke. Okay. So we said that he required students to respect those of all races. He filed for amnesty, but his file was lost, and it wasn't found until 1975. He was granted United States citizenship. In October of 1870, he died of a stroke. Okay, now we're going to talk about Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant. Born in a small cabin in Point Pleasant, Ohio, Hiram Ulysses Grant was the eldest of 6 children. So he was born in a cabin in Port Pleasant, Ohio. And it said he was the oldest of 6 children. He entered West Point at age 17. Okay, at 17 years, he entered West Point. Okay, we said Ulysses S. Grant was born in a cabin in Port Pleasant, Ohio. He was the oldest of 6 children, and he entered West Point at 17 years old. Okay, it says he graduated in the middle of his class. Not wanting to keep his current initials, Grant changed his name to Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. He changed his name from Hiram Ulysses to Ulysses S. After graduating, he married Julia Dent, and they had 4 children. Grant remained in the Army until 1854, at which time he suddenly resigned his commission. Rumors persisted that he was found drunk while on duty and was told to resign or be court-martialed. For the next 6 years, he worked at odd jobs and failed businesses. Okay, he married Julia Dent. And had 4 children. I'm going to put rumor because we don't know if it's true. Found drunk on duty. Told to resign. Found drunk on duty and resigned. Okay. For next 6 years, he worked on odd jobs and failed businesses. Okay, we said that Grant graduated in the middle of his class. He changed his name from Hiram Ulysses to Ulysses S. He married Julia Dent and had 4 children. There was a rumor he was found drunk on duty and he resigned. For the next 6 years, he worked on odd jobs and failed businesses. When Civil War broke out, Grant gathered a group of volunteers from Illinois. He quickly moved up the ranks, becoming the Western Theater commander. While the Union was losing battles in Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, Grant was winning small ones in the West. He successfully repulsed the Confederates at Shiloh and captured Vicksburg at the same time the Battle of Gettysburg was ending. He was eventually chosen commander of all Union forces during the latter stages of the war. His army pursued and fought Lee until the epic surrender at Potomac's courthouse. Okay. So, he volunteered to fight in Civil War. He became the Western Theater commander. It says he won small battles in the West. He won battles at Shiloh and Vicksburg. He was chosen commander during the latter stages of war. Became the commander, he was, okay, wait a minute. Okay, commander of all Union forces. Commander of all Union forces during latter stages of the war. After the war, Grant became involved in politics. Okay, so after the war, he pursued politics. He was elected president in 1868 and re-elected 4 years later. Okay, he became the President of the United States in 1868 and 1872. Although an intensely honest man personally, he did little to stem the tide of corruption that was prevalent in his administration. A number of scandals rocked his presidency as well as a brief recession. The problems did little to hurt his personal integrity, although he is ranked as one of the nation's poorest presidents. Okay. He was ranked as one of America's poorest presidents Okay. So we said that Grant volunteered to fight in the Civil War. He became the Western Theater commander. He won battles at Shiloh and Vicksburg. He was the commander of all Union forces during the latter stages of the war. After the war, he pursued politics. He was President of the United States in 1868 and 1872, and he's ranked as one of America's poorest presidents. After his second term in office ended, he and his wife went on a 2-year world tour. After another brief stint in the political arena following his return, Grant went into business with a partner. The partner, Ferdinand Ward, swindled Grant and other investors out of money, which bankrupted the company and Grant. Because they went on him and his wife went on a 2-year world tour. Grant and wife went on a 2-year world tour. Okay, then he went into business with a partner. His name is Ward. Ward swindled him. Which left him bankrupt. At about the same time this economic blow came, Grant discovered he had a throat cancer. Okay. He found out he has throat cancer. Years of smoking cigars had caught up to him at a time when he had nothing. Fortunately, the famous writer Mark Twain offered to pay Grant for his written memoirs. Grant finished the book very shortly before his death in 1885. The book sold very well, so his family was taken care of after his death. Okay, Mark Twain bought his memoirs He died in 1885. The book sold well. And his family was taken care of. So we said Grant and his wife went on a 2-year world tour after he was the president. He went into business with Ward. Ward swindled him, which left him bankrupt. Then Grant found he had throat cancer. Mark Twain bought his memoirs. Grant died in 1885. The book sold well, and his family was taken care of after his death. Like Lee, Ulysses S. Grant was a devout husband and father. Both men were completely honest and straightforward. It is also noteworthy that both held the highest regard for one another in the years following the war. Let's review. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of the lesson. Facts about Robert E. Lee. He was born at Stafford Hall Plantation, Virginia in 1807. His father died when he was 12 and he ended up living with relatives. He entered the military academy at West Point in 1825 and graduated second in his class. He worked as engineer before serving in the Mexican-American War. He was put in charge of arresting John Brown when he raided Harper's Ferry, resigned his commission in the United States Army when his home state of Virginia seceded from the Union in 1861. He was considered one of the finest military commanders this nation has ever produced. After the war, he served as Washington College president until his death in 1870. He did not officially receive the U.S. citizenship back until 1975 due to an administrative error. Facts about Ulysses S. Grant include he was born in a cabin at Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822. He entered West Point in 1839 and graduated in the middle of his class. He served in the Mexican-American War. He remained in the military until 1854 when he resigned. He worked at odd jobs until the Civil War broke out. He fought in the Western Theater of the War at Shiloh and Vicksburg. He became the top commanding officer of Union forces. He fought Lee several times before forcing him to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. He was elected president twice, in 1868 and 1872. He went into private business where he was swindled and became bankrupt. He wrote his memoirs after being stricken with throat cancer, and he died in 1885. His book sold well, and his family was taken care of after his death. Okay, go ahead and study your lesson, study your notes, and answer the questions.